just in front, just where the ramp connects. Like I like uh, uh, the proportion. Yeah, I like the proportion it has. The voids are created in. So this floor consists of and it is a free planned, and there are it is very common that Le Corbusier works with free plans, and then has this curved walls wherever he feels it necessary. Like in the third plan, you see this is auditorium, and yeah, I'll show you. The pictures are ahead. So this is the ground floor plan. The ground floor has left on stilts with very minimal spaces, and the glass on the first floor and the rest above. Yeah, so these are the photos when it was built early in like yeah, these are those times of like the photos that were clicked at that time. And yeah, so this is the door at the first floor where this like at the second floor where this ramp takes and then the staircase takes you. So what I like here is like this door is acting as a like for me it is a perfect threshold between inside and outside. You clearly can't say what's the way he has played with uh, the the solid forms and the voids here is like I really like it. And he usually creates such huge openings like the door here. He usually has square doors which are mainly hand painted by himself. And then yeah, yeah. So the staircases at the Millionaires are like I find them very extraordinary because they are a combination of aesthetics and engineering. So as staircase, uh, uh, there is the beam which is like the beam which is coming from the column, and then it is taking the load, and then the way he has like in both the staircases in the center and the left side. Uh, the handrail is also like very appropriately arranged, and in fact in the central staircase it is the beam which is acting as a handrail, and which is a quite good combination of aesthetics and engineering. uh, yeah, and this third photo is from one of our seniors who had sneaked in Millionaires and had these photos for us. And yeah, this is the auditorium which I talked about uh, in this one, um, in this slide. So this curved walls act like engulf the space, and then this walls are wooden finished, and it's a very good space. And this yeah, this is the like these are some of the photos from Milonas where you can see the columns from the free plan, and the um, and this he called them brosolis, where like which were modern kind of chajjas which prevented light to enter the building, but also acted as frames for the viewers. And there were also places where you could just place vegetation. Yeah, and this is what he used in many of his buildings in India. This was one of his concepts. And yeah, so now it's Villa Shodhan. Gargi, would you like to take it over from here, or I should show uh, the
No,
Rochamp
no.
first and then?
Yeah, yeah, works like that also.
Okay, cool. Okay, so this is the Rochamp in France. This is a chapel which is located on the top of a hill, and here the architect. This is a conceptual drawing of Le Corbusier, and he wanted to create some a space which like which would feel like which would make one feel with inner joy, had have peace, and one where one can pray. Yeah, and this the sketch where you can see this is a sketch of Le Corbusier when he was on his grand tour, when he was exploring and like studying architecture from different realms of history. And so this chapel is also considered like one of the monumental structure sitting on top of hill, just like this, the Parthenon and Acropolis. Yeah. So the materiality and the texture used in this structure is very different from rest of his projects. Here he has used uh, like much organic form, and also the texture is the like sprayed concrete over the walls. Like I don't know, this way of materiality helps in like helps the structure to be one with the landscape. This like the way the light falls on this on the edge. So, uh, first is the main entrance. Second is the nave, which is facing the main altar, and the sixth one and the seventh one are small chapels, which are the evening and the morning chapel. So this the skylight you get in this chapels is on the seventh chapel has a fenestration which is facing east. So you get the light from east in the morning, and hence it is called as a morning chapel. And the same happens in the sixth one. Fourth one is the main chapel. So the tenth is a external so the one of the programs given to the architect was they wanted a smaller gathering place and a larger gathering place. So uh, so so the architect came up with the intervention that why can't be there why can't be there a larger outer space outdoor space where you can celebrate in larger quantities, and the ideal will be us like in the center, like the can you see the top left image, and there is a square fenestration in the wall. So this fenestration in this fenestration there is a ideal place which can be rotated accordingly wherever the program or the ritual is taking place, either indoor or outdoor. um, yeah, so the roof for the Rochamp is very extraordinary. Can you see the white the roof seems floating because of the because it is not coming in contact with the heavy walls underneath. There is a thin silver line which is seen from the inside, and this is the section for the Rochamp. The roof is fully reinforced concrete of 6 centimeters thick, and so the roof is often conceptualized, like people say like there are many theories behind it. Some say that it looks like a hand, some say it looks like a cloud. But what I interestingly read about it is that Le Corbusier was repeatedly inspired by an empty crab shell he found on a local island, on Long Island, in Long Island, sorry. So yeah, and these are the fenestrations which are there uh, in the chapel. So if you see these fenestrations, they look very small from the outside, but they are very cleverly crafted in such a way that there is a maximum light inside, and the glass present here are hand painted by him, by Le Corbusier. And yeah, these are the some of the glasses, and the details I really liked. So even the benches in the chapel are a combination of wood and concrete, which are designed like very clever, like uh, and the staircases as usual are of raw concrete. Yeah, this is the main chapel. I don't know, like the create something which would feel peaceful, but many things are happening in this chapel. I don't really, at least from the photos, it looks like many things are going, and I don't know if one would feel at peace. I guess we can't say anything unless we go, but at least from the photos, I feel that there are many things going on at a time, which yeah, they are there is a fantastic composition of all these things, but I don't know if it is successful in creating that peaceful ambience in the interiors. Yeah, I'm done here.
Sarthak,
Yeah,
will
Gadi, you can
you
take over.
stop? Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. Okay. Yes.
Yeah, can you see my screen? Hello.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we
Yeah.
can see.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so talking about Villa Shodhan is located in Ahmedabad, Gujarat. So it was designed for a warmer climate and an extroverted client. Villa Shodhan is a story of a roof parasol. A roof parasol is basically a fitting device which is used in a hot and dry climate where shade is essential during the daytime and the outdoor is pleasant in the evening. So the house is composed to kinetically balance the solids with the voids, a dynamic sculpture that will keep changing with the position of the sun through the mutual shading. Villa Shodhan is basically also known as an update of Villa Savoy. Also, in Villa Shodhan, what one could notice is that it comprises of several themes of Cabussier's earlier work, and it's a synthesis of its previous ideas, which are just played at an higher pitch. So, looking at the ground floor plan of Villa Savoy, so basically can you see the wait, 1 second? Yeah. So basically, you enter into the Shodhan Villa through the northwest entry. So you enter in from here, and then you have a blank wall here, and then there is a void in here which takes you in. So this is a porch which is there, which is cantilevered. So as you enter, it takes you in the space which is defined by walls and freestanding ramps. So this ramp, which is transversely placed, it is placed in such a way that all the living room and the dining room, they get their privacy. uh, that's the reason for placing the ramp exactly here. And the bottleneck which is there, which is created here at the confluence of horizontal and vertical circulation, at the commencement of the ramp. It further marks the threshold, that is, this acts as a threshold for the living room and the dining room. And the living and the dining rooms, they also extend into the gardens which are extend naturally into the gardens which are there. So the ground floor, it is like double, the ground floor is double heighted, and the ground floor is like double heighted. And then when you come to the second floor is basically simple with just bedrooms and open terraces. The third floor, it has living spaces composed with variety of open and closed spaces. So this ramp which is there, so there's a ramp which takes you from the ground floor to the third floor, meets the stairway to the top of the main living room. So the upper floors, that is the second and the third floor, they generally contain only sleeping areas, and the ramp, it actually acts as a device which leads you like for smooth transition and gradual climb. So the so in this section, basically what you could say is, you have these ramps which are there, then you have staircases at different levels. Then there is through this also one could notice that there is an interplay of closed, semi-closed spaces like low and high volumes, spatial variety, and visual continuity. So this is actually this roof which you can see here, that is the roof parasol which is there. So the roof parasol, it is supported by 4 columns that run from the ground floor to the top of the roof. That is a speciality of like Villa Shodhan, that is the roof parasol which is there. Basically, a parasol means like an umbrella which protects you from the sun. Then talking about the Brizoli, so it is basically a screen which is usually lured, placed outside the main building to protect you from to protect the building and the windows from the sunlight. So the Brizoli emerged as an update of the Villa Savoy, and what one could see through these were the parasol roof and the connectivity which is there, that is the ramps and the staircases, can be seen from the exterior through these Brizolis. Then such modulation of the southwest, so this basically the Brizolis are present to the southwest of the southwest position, so that it provides you the much needed shade from the haze of the sun and the haze and heat of the sun, while keeping it transparent for preventing breeze, as well as it gives you views of the outdoor. So here Kabushi also tried to incorporate what like from the local architecture which was also there. So the ground floor here, the living room of the ground floor is like double storied over here, and also that was the characteristic which he found out to be there present in the houses which he looked around. And also what he does is, lets the nature into the house, which was also again a characteristic which he found out to be common there. So one more thing which was very prominent in Vilashodhan was the brightness of colors, which was used against the neutral, concrete, monotonous backdrop. So basically, he used such colored doors and windows or window frames which are there. And then here, what happens is in Vilashodhan is basically that you have a freestanding roof here, but the mass, such a bulky mass, is anchored to the ground. And also, Vilashodhan is like based has the 5 principles which Corbusier, like based on the Kabushi's 5 principles, like you have these horizontal windows over here, then you have the free floor plans in like many of his buildings, then you have these roof gardens which you can see here, then you have these pilotis which were again a major thing of Kabushi's architecture, and then you can see the free facade over here. So talking about the next structure, that is the La Tourette. La Tourette is located in France. So it is like Cobb's final building, which is completed in Europe and is also thought by many to be his most unique program. So it was built to be a self-contained world for community of silent monks. So Father Couturier told him that the building had to show poverty, which was one of the main principles of Domitian order, and it had to accommodate the unique and specific study of lifestyle of monks. So it had to be an appropriate place where the monks could study, have a comfortable temperature and silence. So the site, it was specifically chosen as Corbusier wanted, was drawn towards the steeply sloping banks with powerful views. So the structure, it's basically RCC with undulating glass. So so the monastery, it's basically composed of 4 rectangular structures with one which acts as a church, and the other 3 acts as the cells for the monks, the libraries, the refectory, a hall, and such kind of things. So basically, when you look through here, the road, you can only see these are the cells which are there, and this is like the church which is there. So talking about the plan which is there, the building it seems that the building has a complicated plan, but majority of its inhabitable spaces, they're divided across three main levels. So the lowest will basically provide access to the church which is there and the houses and the refectory. Second one, here you can see this is like the church which is there. This becomes the pantry, this becomes the refectory, this is a spiral staircase which is there. So when you come to the next level, this is again the church which is continued, but here now again you have these like rooms and rooms, libraries and everything. And the second contains like public entrances with reception rooms, porter's lodge, study rooms, library, oratory and common rooms. So the third floor is completely dedicated to the cells which are there for the monks. Then it had to be, so the building basically, it had to be a chapel, a residence and a place of learning for Dominican friars. The monastery groups, so the monastery, when you look here, it's a group which is around a central, it's like a U-shaped mass which is there in a central courtyard which is there. So it's a video basically. So this is like, you take a house, you free it from the ground floor, like you lift it up from the ground floor so that you increase the garden area, then you take away the roof and you introduce terrace gardens in that, then you free the facade of it. And so you free the facade of it and you use these stilts which are there to connect the slabs between two floors, and this is like free facade where glass can be used with total freedom. So this is what the location of La Tourette was really beautiful. So since it was open to the landscape, it makes it Corbusier wanted to make most use of the natural light the most. So he thought common cloisters wouldn't be necessary there. What he did was, so basically this is what he had thought about that. So basically this was supposed to be the church, and this was supposed to be the monastery, the living cells, the library and everything. So but what he thought was, the church of La Tourette, basically it was open to everyone coming there who had belief or faith. So to mark the difference between the monastery and the church, he created a void, like he pulled it away, and so hence a void was created up here. So this void in real structure also is kept it open. So this is the void basically which you see here. So this is the church, and then you have a void over here to basically mark the difference. So the next thing is, here the next thing, this is the section. The section basically makes you see it. Basically the section is here, and so you can, from this road, it's the church and these cells which are visible. But as the slopes goes down, you could see the pilotis over here, and this is like the floors basically increase to the other end of the slope. Yeah, so talking about the pilotis, which was again main feature of the Corbusier's architecture. So it was like he had pilotis which would help to raise the structure up, and then he had these horizontal windows to provide light for equal rooms. So sorry, to provide equal light for all the rooms inside. Then talking about this was the corridors which was there, and they were covered. So basically the ramps and the corridors, they were covered by the flat roof which is there up here, and the flat thing was covered by green space. So when you look here, these are basically the cells which are there, and these are basically the facades. These are basically the interiors of the library and everything. So here you see that there's only a horizontal slit which is there. Well, here you can see glass and concrete panels which are there. So this difference in the interior side of the facade is because he believed that there should be different facades for different functions. So the interior facades of the library, refectory, lecture halls, they have these glass and concrete. These are basically known as the Mondrian squares which are there. Then talking about the refectory and the chapter, he broke with the typical idea of the monastery, and he opened the large room. So basically he opened the large rooms, and he wanted to let in the view. So he wanted the view to let in into the structure, and so that the contemplation of nature could be a source of meditation. Here you can see what he's used is, these are the concrete mullions, and these are the glass panes which he has used. Then talking about the cells, so there are 100 cells which are present for the monks which are there. So these basically these cells, so the interior of the cells, basically that this is the interior of the cells, I mean this is the interior of the cells and this is the exterior. So the exterior of the cells, basically this area, these has the balconies which are there to allow the contact to the outside world and like basically have views. But the interior, he didn't want so the interior, basically it has only the horizontal line which is present there. And also the cell, it was developed according to Kabush's La Modular. They were very simple volumes with 5 meter 90 centimeters long, 1 meter 83 centimeters wide, and 2 meter 26 centimeters height. So basically, it was designed in such a way that it could accommodate a bed, a chair, a table, a wardrobe, and a toilet. That's it. And there were these long horizontal loopholes which gave sunlight. And so these portions which were basically protrude out, they were known as the sugar lumps. So yeah, so these sugar lumps which are there, they were like the structural support which were provided. But to make it kind of more interesting or thing, he blocked it up to here with like concrete blocks, and then only this portion was kept open so that the passage gets lit by the sunlight. So now talking about the church of the Latoret, it was a church. The church was basically a concrete box without any openings. The openings, they were not visible from the outside, but they were visible from the inside. So this vertical slit was designed in such a way that the light of sun could enter in, and this horizontal slit, which you can see, it was designed in such a way that the church would be lit by the light of the setting sun. So, as most of the churches have like rose windows or glass windows, none of them is present in the Lazaret. Basically, he used vents, horizontal vents, which are there, which were painted in bright colors. These are the horizontal vents which he used to let the light in. So here, what he has is this is the main church, and on this side of the church, there's a ear shaped. There is a ear shaped basically crypt. So two buildings adjoining each side of the main structure on the outside of the quadrilateral. So this is a crypt which is like ear shaped, and which has these cannons, which has these cannon mouths to let the light in. So you can see these are the cannon mouths which are there. So this crypt, ear like crypt, has these cannon mouths, and this is the sacristy which had like machine gun like projections. So it had like 7 geometric machine gun like projections to let the light in. So this is this thing. So these machine guns would let the light in. So a crypt is basically a chamber which contains coffins or religious relics, and a sacristy is a room where the priest prepares for his service. So so basically the crypt on one side and the sacristy on the other gave the cross. Sorry, the church basically had a traditional cross shape due to the presence of the Christ on one side and the sacristy on the other. So this was the sacristy which is there. So this was basically the light. Light could come in through here, and these things which are here. So yeah, so talking about the horizontal basically vents which he kept here, and he painted them with bright colors so that light could let in. Here there's no glass which is there, but it's only these open things. And here basically he placed them in such a way that when the monks they sit to read any religious script, so that light could fall in, and it is like it could be properly read. It was positioned in such a way. So talking next about the roof. Talking next about the roof of the entire structure. It's like it was a place where everyone could, like, one could walk, meditate between the sky, and it was surrounded by a wall. This is surrounded entirely by a wall which is like up to 1.8 meters in height. So looking next thing, so basically this is a structure. So here it is like, and on the upper floor it's like the cells which are there, and then below it is the library and everything. So what would one expect, that this would be an open courtyard which is there, but it was not. But actually it's not opened. It has these there is an it has these passage of cloisters which is there, which he calls as conduits to regulate the main flow through the monastery. So these conduits are basically to regulate the flow of people so that it does not become crowded in the monastery and everything. So basically these conduits, they appear to be like this. It's like ramps and everything so that people could walk in through there. And yeah, so basically when you look at Latoret from exterior, it's seemed to be one thing. It appears to be a cube whose facade aligns the variations of a single theme. Uh, it's like appears to be very geometric from the exterior side, basically a one thing which follows the same theme. But when you come into the interiors, it becomes like the courtyard presents enigmatic and disturbing scenes. So it becomes like the juxtaposition of simple volumes. So when you look at it, this is the atrium which has a sloping roof. Then these are the sugar lumps which are there, of the cells which are there. Then this becomes the oratory. This becomes the oratory with square, basically a cube shape oratory which has like a pyramidal roof. And then this becomes the cloister, and then this becomes the machine guns. So basically it's like, what I feel personally, it was like from the exterior it appears to be a very simple plain kind of thing, but when one comes into the interior, it's like so many geometric forms inside there, creating a different kind of composition which is there. That's it. Hello.
My microphone was muted. Sorry. Is there anyone else, or that was it for today, right?
Yeah, like me and
Okay.
Sarthak only had this much.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thanks for that. It's an interesting kind of way in which both of you all chose to present, and I think it's for something for us to kind of start thinking about. Right? Both of you looked at the building kind of directly as an object, and both of you all started analyzing the building for its various elements and things like that. Now, that is the kind of thing that both of you did, right? And it's an interesting to think about that when we are talking about theory of design, we tend to kind of talk about the building as a separate entity. But when we are thinking about theorizing it, we are in some way trying to place it uh, within some sort of larger frame, right? Both of you all presented the building very well, but I think it may be interesting to start thinking about where do Corbusier's formal ideas, where do they come from? Why is he doing what he's doing? Uh, can anyone, like, okay, let's just talk about Ronchamp, right? So Ronchamp was a very strange chapel, right? That's what you also said. Kiar, Sarthak said, Kiar, I don't know how it's supposed to make people kind of feel, how should I put it, religious. Um, why do you think that he designed the building the way he did? Any ideas? Yeah. I'm trying to find the window here. Yeah. Okay. Any ideas as to why did he do what he did? Any clues?
Is it related to the World War in any sense?
In what way? I
Or
mean, okay, first of all, an important thing whenever you're analyzing a building is to place it within history. Okay, is to say when it was built and where it was built. Okay, these are important things because it will help you understand what is the context within which a building is emerging. Because those contexts themselves are many. Now, first there is, like, the Shodhan Villa is in Ahmedabad in India. Okay, how did Corbusier arrive in Ahmedabad in India? And why was this kind of architecture accepted in India at that particular time is an important story. Uh, so yes, I would say that it's important to the question that you're asking, Sarthak, is a good one to say that uh, like what are the historical facts or what are the historical phenomenon that led to these kinds of approaches? Because Corbusier wasn't the only one, but he was probably one of the most famous ones to kind of do these things. So any other sorts of ideas you guys have? क्यों करते हैं लोग? Why do people do these things? What was he trying to do? Arey, say something. I'm not good. This is going to be a conversation class. As you know, it's all about the chat window. So we're going to wait until somebody chats in the window, because otherwise I can talk forever, but it doesn't necessarily make too much sense. Somebody? Or should I just start picking people?
Ayushi, I think, raised her hand, and Shreyansh has something to say.
Okay,
there are people
good.
who are raising their hand. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. So this is interesting. Shreyansh says that it looks like a child has drawn a countryside house on top of a hilly ground. And for Divit, he's saying maybe for modern man, the design, but not for religion. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about. The both what Shreyansh is saying as well as what Divit is saying. So there's this word that we've been kind of talking about, and the word is modern. And I think from last time, one of the things that we were talking about the modern was this need that people felt for a transformation, a sudden kind of transformation. It was felt that something in the world had changed. There were some dramatic things that were changing in the world. And for that, architecture also needed to change. Architecture also needed to respond to those dramatic changes that were happening. So if you can place yourself in the 1890s, can you just tell me what were the things that were really changing in the world, or rather in this case in Western Europe at that particular time? Type away. We have time. Does anyone want to kind of try that? Um, Sarthak.
Yes.
Tell me, what do you think was changing in the early 1900s in Europe? No?
I
Okay.
can think of the World War II and
World War II is
at that
1914. Sorry, World War One is 1914.
yeah, World War
World
II
War
was around 45 or 50, something like that.
40s, early 40s, late 30s and early 40s. Okay, so I'm going to kind of just generally talk a little bit. Okay, and maybe then we can start looking at Corbusier again and think about where his particular architecture is coming from. Rahul, the abolition of slavery didn't happen until, uh, I mean, I don't think that's directly relevant here right now. But nevertheless, I think industrialization is a point that Divya is kind of raising, which is a good point. So let me just kind of place this.
मला पाणी देतेस
Sorry?
प्लीज.
Sorry, somebody's saying something. I can't hear. Okay. So what is happening right now? Where is Corbusier, kind of placed? Corbusier is is a man pretty much of the early 20th century. And in the earlier 20th century, like we spoke in the last class, you had the cities of Europe changing very rapidly. You had a great deal of industrialization, which meant that the machine became more and more part of people's lives. They were seeing machines around. You had motor cars, you had all of these symbols of movement that seemed to be around. Everyone's kind of, there were airplanes now, suddenly people could fly. And there was a sort of promise that was handed out by these imaginations, a promise that man and technology seemed to be in a relationship with each other that was in a good relationship, like machines were going to set people free. And this idea of freedom becomes an important one. Man removed from his villages, coming into the city, is now coming and he's separated from his old kind of Gao. When he comes into the new world, the possibility that this person has is to be able to kind of completely make himself anew. This person can become a new person entirely. And that new person, who is this new person? And what is the architecture that's going to house this new person becomes a question for us. One thing that we know about this new person is that older ties to the village, older ties to the church have been kind of broken. Suddenly, the church is not central to somebody's life. There is other concepts. Otherwise, in the earlier village, the person was tied down by his class or his kind of church affiliations, or there were all these things that were tying people down. When this person comes into the city, these entire kind of ties have completely been broken. And because these ties have been broken, God is no longer central to people's lives. Instead, actually, what starts becoming central to people's lives is the idea of the human being itself. Suddenly, you're saying that the human being has autonomy, has freedom. The human being has kind of some sort of, how should I put it? Uh, Independence of thought. Right? a human being is free to choose his destiny or her destiny. Suddenly, the human being has a sort of kind of broken ties. And in this kind of world where the human being has broken ties, the architecture has to respond to this new kind of human being. So let's think about what the characteristics of this new human being could have been. One of the things we've already spoken of, this new human being is not necessarily tied down by religious ties. Okay? This new human being is looking for freedom. Okay? And we shall talk about maybe these two first. With the removal of God as the central thing, you have to find something else upon which you can base your own ethics. What is good, what is bad, all of those things. We need some sort of way to be able to decipher that. And reason and rationality become the way in which one can do that. Scientific thought, in other words. So if you think scientifically, if you think rationally, maybe you can come up with some sort of idea as to what this new human being is and what is the kind of architecture that we need for this new human being. The other thing is freedom. Now, this human being wants to be free, right? This person wants to be free. Where can that freedom be found? Often the freedom lies either in the rationality or in the kind of mathematics of the mathematics of rationality, but it can also lie in finding the true self of the human being. Now, what this true self is the true self can't be found in older ties. The true self can't be found in older identities. The true self has to be found by the human being within himself or herself. And where is this true self going to be found? In nature. And it is in nature it is assumed that in nature you can just kind of be free because nature is pure and you will also be pure in nature. So what happens is that there is an idea that this human being is going to be purified by nature. So architecture becomes almost an intermediary to make a new relationship between man and nature. Yeah? And also to talk about the man himself as a natural being. Natural in a sense कि यार ये सब जो होता है ना civilization, capitalism, ये सब नहीं है. क्या है कि man और nature में एक pure relationship है. और ये प्योरिटी जो है ना वो प्रिमिटिव होता है कि प्रिमिटिव म्हणजे कि देयर इज नो सोफिस्टिकेशन अराउंड इट इज एकदम ऐसे ब्रूटल like you can stand naked on the edge of the rocks and that kind of, and it's on these kinds of places where we find our true wild selves that we find our truth. Now what Corbusier in the early years and Corbusier in the later years actually goes through quite a bit of a transition, and the works that we saw this time are largely Corbusier's later work. In the early work of Corbusier, if you kind of look at the various works that he's done, you'll find that he seems to be kind of, in some sense, rationalizing quite a bit, like Villa Savoye and all. Are kind of, they follow that kind of neat system of the 5 ticks, the pilotis, the roof garden, the free, that all of those things are there. As his kind of career progresses and as he gets more and more interested in art and culture, you see his work begin to kind of modulate into much more free, playful sorts of forms. The reason why we chose these five examples is that they belong to that later phase where you can see him in many ways really trying to make an architecture that can house this sort of primitive kind of freedom that he had tried to attempt. So if you look at something like, let's talk about mill owners. Now mill owners is a very, have you all been there? You all should go there if you all haven't. But mill owners is a very, very beautiful and very strange building. The building is just like a kind of box. It has hardly any program. The biggest program is that auditorium at the upper level. Okay? But the most of the rest of the stuff is just empty space. You rise and in that empty space, he creates a space where the body of this new man is allowed to roam free. Where the structure of the building and the enclosure systems actually create fluid movement between sectionally and in terms of in plan that allows one kind of space to move into the other. There is no rationality like you see sometimes in some of his earlier work, right? Which also you don't see because he very often was breaking his own rules. But what you see in Mill Owners is this attempt to create a dynamic, vibrant sort of moving of space. So you come up, and there are like, 3 or 4 ways of moving in the building. You come up that ramp, you kind of turn around, you climb up that stair, then you have another stair that takes you backwards, you have a kind of dog-legged that takes you at another level. So there is this perpetual kind of that body that he's designing for is this constantly moving body. There's hardly any place of rest. Even the places of rest that are there are these concrete benches that are actually quite uncomfortable to sit on often. So it's interesting to kind of think about that. Now, Mill Owners was designed in India and in the 50s, right? And it was designed in Ahmedabad. And Ahmedabad actually has a lot of Corbusier buildings, which is interesting. Now, why does Ahmedabad have a lot of Corbusier buildings? So when Corbusier is been called by Nehru, I won't talk, you know that story because it was there in Nostalgia for the Future. When Corbusier was called by Nehru to say that, yeah, come and help us imagine a city for the new citizen. This is what Corbusier's task was. So Corbusier, in the spaces that he was making, was designing spaces to cater to who the new citizenship of this newly born country was going to be. That is what he was trying to design for. So he had this incredible utopian project. He wanted to, and in Nehru's vision and in the visions of the early modernists, there was little to be gained by looking back on history. Because after all, the Indian kind of in India as an idea had so many different histories and so many different geographies and so many different languages. And if all of these differences had to be collected together in one nation, that nation needed one utopian ideal, one idea that we should all become this. And what was imagined, that thing that we would all become, is the idea of the Indian citizen. And Corbusier was given the task to say that through the architecture that you make, through the architecture that you create, you will shape who the Indian citizen is supposed to be. And the reason Corbusier was called to do this was naturally because he was presenting himself as a person who was able to do it. Because of his earlier work, because of the fact that he was talking about modernism as a new beginning, because he was offering a break with the past, because he was saying that the new century and the new human being needs new places to live. He had done buildings like that. So Corbusier seemed to be the person that we went and got, saying that, Acha, you have these ideas, we are going to offer you the opportunity to shape the new Indian citizen through the making of spaces. Right. So he's doing that, and you had many sorts of fairly rich and privileged individuals in this country, studied abroad, modernists, because they had kind of studied abroad often, who had bought into this particular idea of the nation state. And they felt that Corbusier was an architect who could in some way help them shape their own domestic spaces as well. So mill owners who are rich mill owners and industrialists decided to kind of hire Corbusier to design buildings for them. And these buildings were in some ways performances for these people. They wanted to display their own modernity. They wanted to say, yeah, we are also modern. We are so modern that the guy who's designing Chandigarh, he's designing houses for us, right? And often that you find that, so these really kind of bourgeois homes become display pieces for a particular class to display its own modernity. I am modern, man, look at my house. And Corbusier gets these commissions to do so. What Corbusier does with these commissions is interesting. He brings to these commissions a brutality and like a sort of primitive textures. How should I put it? The texture of concrete in its bareness, exposed brick. There are all these sorts of ways in which these buildings seem to rise from the dust of the country as these rugged pieces of work. That's not necessarily so of, let's say, Ronchamp, right? Ronchamp is very, very different, and that is also made in the similar period. But in the buildings in India, he uses concrete very extensively, and he uses concrete sculpturally. He doesn't fall for the idea that concrete buildings are boring, or concrete buildings will, the usual grid will happen and you'll put slab. He uses concrete for its sculptural nature, both in the Shodhan House as well as in the building that we saw today in Mill Owners, and also in some of the other work that he's done in Chandigarh, where he floats roofs. Heavy roofs are floating off columns. The columns of the columns in the High Court. I don't know whether you all know the. Do you all know the buildings of Chandigarh, by the way? Just say yes or no, somebody.
We have been
Sorry?
to Chandigarh.
You've been to Chandigarh, right? So that's great, because you've seen the buildings in Chandigarh. That High Court building, maybe we'll just discuss. A big heavy roof that's floating over three columns that are, they're literally psychedelic colored, now pink, yellow, and blue, and that was sky blue or something like that. There is no, the railings on the opposite side of the plaza are shaped like lightning bolts. There's a sort of freedom of expression and a freedom of form making and playfulness that you see particularly in the later work, particularly in the buildings of Chandigarh and things like that. That playfulness is also what you see within La Tourette, like we saw today. Because in La Tourette, that entire kind of boring concrete cube, which is actually anything but boring, is a bunch of kind of completely beautiful, strange sculptural pieces that allow a playful kind of way in which light and shadow is kind of working within. It's a far cry from the kind of boring imagination that you would have that modernism is standardized. Instead, what he's doing here is, with the kind of play of light and shadow, with the kind of real freedom through which he's kind of exploring concrete, he's making an architecture that the human being, that person, that modern man, can celebrate his own sense of his body. So what happens here is that architecture becomes a vehicle through which the body's senses are stimulated. It becomes a way of playing with light and shadow, and not in the usual way, but in sort of these extraordinarily kind of inventive ways. The kind of relationship of man to God in Ronshamp is replaced by the relationship of man to light. So light, which is what very often is used to kind of represent the divine, becomes a sort of sculptural object. Now he's working with it, he's sculpting it, he's turning it, he's twisting it, he's coloring it, and he's playing with it so that man can sense the divine through the experience of light. But really his interest is in the making of the space to experience light. So let's go back to who this person is meant to be, this modern man. So the modern man that Corbusier seems to be designing for is one who has separated himself from history and geography, who exists as a pure quote unquote being, who is able to experience his, and I mean his here, because Corbusier was very often only talking about men, his body in nature, in light. There's a primitive relationship between him and the body. The body of the man stands naked in nature and is able to experience nature directly. Because, the modern man doesn't need all this sort of old-fashioned things like kind of plaster and all. The modern man can see truth in nature and therefore can stand naked in nature. And that seems to be the center of these five works. The presentation of the primitive as the ultimate the presence of the primitive as that where ultimate modernity lies. And maybe there I can kind of go back to what Shreyansh was talking about. Because Shreyansh is saying that, it looks to him like a child who has drawn a countryside house on top of a hilly ground. And yeah, it comes from that. No, it's like an expression. It doesn't come with too much thought, because thought and rationality and all, whatever, you need to kind of really feel things. So that building, Ronshamp, seems to kind of emerge from the ground as a piece of sculpture of light. thick walls, enormously thick walls that don't go up vertically but actually kind of dance and carry this roof that is floating and hovering over the head. A kind of thin sliver of light cuts through and allows you to kind of, how should I put it? You feel the light. The entire roof seems like it's heavy, but it's light because it's floating. Uh, so it seems as if what he's trying to do is really sculpt experience. And through experience, begin to transform man's relationship with nature and man's relationship with other men. Yeah. This is uniquely, and I think, an important thing to think about, because I think this idea of architecture, architecture as a place where architecture is a vehicle for truth telling, and in this case, truth in nature and kind of experience and the primitive body, is an important theme that you find that we today also seem to be fairly besotted by. It's something that kind of very often is in our minds. The fact that the way that we look at nature, the way that we look at architecture, the way we love to kind of talk about the purity of truth to materials, all of these things are ideas that have been handed down to us by this entire kind of history. Corbusier, of course, was instrumental in and has been extremely influential around the world, but especially for us in India. Especially for us in India, because his work seemed to represent an ideal of modernity that we then decided to embrace, for better or worse, but we did decide to embrace. Our architecture schools, we had many architects who were greatly influenced by Corbusier, Doshi included, and many in Delhi, whose work seemed to take off from Corbusier's and try and evolve an Indian idiom for that. What Corbusier also did is that in his translation of his ideas into different contexts, he treated climate as one of the important things that helped him shape his buildings. Now that is interesting. He didn't think about really the old historical house types. I don't know where he got that information from. He was not concerned with all of these things. His main concern was the feel of the land and the feel of nature, and therefore his interest in climate. So when he makes these brises soleils, etc., he's doing it to make a relationship with the natural, because, like I said in the beginning, the people that he's imagining his houses for belong to that particular kind of performance of modernity. They are performing a modernity of primitiveness, if you are understanding what I'm trying to say. By returning to their most primitive form, they are showing themselves to be truly modern because they don't need all that other shit. This is fundamentally where it's coming from. I would highly recommend actually that whenever we are looking at an architect's work or whenever we are looking at a building, and I think that blog is going to help you do that, is to look at stuff around that building. What I mean is, let's always place a time, a year on the building, always. Okay, let's always look at where and the specifics of that location. What was happening in that place at that time? Okay, what are the various things that were influencing things? There may or may not be a direct connection, but it's interesting to think that this kind of object happened at this time, at this place. And the third is to always think about biographies to some extent. Like Corbusier, in some sense, was a person who was influenced by his world. He had ideas that came from his world. So to be able to understand an architect better, or to be able to understand work better, it becomes important to not imagine that whatever they've done is universally good or universally bad, but to rather place it within that particular world and think from our point of view, he's doing this because of this reason. Is that okay for us or is that not okay for us? Or what relevance does that kind of idea have for us? And this is what I would say. So if one has to, in some sense, go back to the presentations and really start thinking about who were the Shodhans and why were they building that house, and then let's kind of do some kind of speculation. Let's have some fun, because after all, this is a place for open-ended conversation as to kyun kar rahe the? I mean, why this particular kind of idea? And we can have a conversation about it, and we can have an opinion on that. That can be quite an interesting thing to do as well. Why did anybody, I mean, why did they decide on building Rosham when they could have built a nice, beautiful, conventional church, which could have worked like Sarthak said, which would have been nice and holy and pleasant and, would have been perfectly all right for use. What were they trying to do then? How has, and it's an important question to think, how has the idea of religion itself, okay, and its transformation from being something that was central to our lives, at least in Western Europe, where hardly anybody is kind of openly, or I mean, there's so many people are secular now. But at one time, that wasn't so. Everyone was very, very church going. But with reason and with industrialization and with modernity, you have the church or God becoming central and God becoming marginal, what is often called the death of God. यार अभी God है कि नहीं पता नहीं, and as soon as you say God है कि नहीं पता नहीं, in some ways you've killed God ना, because you made him हो सकता है नहीं हो सकता है. And with the displacement of God, we had the human being at the center, and with the human being coming into the center, you have this entire what happens to the idea of religion when the human being is now central to it. And then what happens to the story of architecture when the human being is now central to architecture, to the world, and what does that mean for religious buildings? It's an interesting thing to think about. I've not come to any kind of particular conclusion concerning this, but it's an interesting to think about. In a secular world, what is the role of a religious building? I would suggest that you kind of go back. I think all of you should perhaps go back to Corbusier's work. All his buildings are available online. Read the plans carefully. Go over the plan. Take a look at it. Take a look at these drawings, and think about the context within which these buildings have emerged and what that can mean. So did people who went to, I think Dia is asking a question, did the people who went to actually pray at Ronchamp like the building? I wouldn't know, quite honestly, but I do know that Charles Correa designed a building in Bombay, which was also a fairly unusual church. It's called the Salvakau Church. It's in Mahim, and it was an unusual building. It had three kind of, I guess you would call it, spaces which were lit from the sky. M.F. Hussain drew some murals on those skylights and had these courtyards, but had no outwardly didn't have any cross as a symbol. And that is how it was in the beginning. And many people hated that building because it didn't in many ways convey what they conventionally thought of as a church. So finally, they had to add a facade with a kind of cross on top, just for people to kind of get a sense कि अच्छा ये church है यार, जाकर we can pray there. But I have no information on whether people actually prayed at Rosham. I've never been there actually, and I would really like to go, but never been there. Sorry. Parth is asking, when comparing Le Corbusier and Tadao Ando using exposed concrete as a material, I find Tadao Ando's work to be far more refined in terms of texture, light quality, finish, and experience overall. Parth, do you mean finish in a sense ki the smoothness of the concrete? Is that what you mean when you say finish?
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah. It may be so, but I don't think Corbusier was trying to go for smoothness. It's often the case, right, especially with architects, that because we are so finicky about let's say the corners have to meet and the details have to be clean and everything has to be smooth, that we think that if it's chakachak, it is good. I don't think Corbusier was even trying chakachak. I think the entire attempt was to keep things rough, like it's a piece of nature. So when we are like when you're walking into what's that building here, Shodhan House, it's like a big fat concrete kind of block, and then when you enter inside, it's really dark like a lobby. It's like entering a cave, and in that cave you have this sort of ramp that's going up, and you start walking up that ramp, And as you're walking up that ramp, the light keeps the spaces keep kind of opening out on both sides. It's like walking up a sort of mountain. And that ramp turns around, you go upstairs, and that slowly that stair and that roof that's floating above opens out until you see the sky. Um, so what Corbusier seems to be doing is creating almost an architectural version of a walk in nature. Uh, what Ando does is quite different, for better or worse. It's another sort of way of dealing with things. Ando's world seems to be one where he's trying to, in some sense, meditate on emptiness, because his work is often turning its back on the outside, and he has these empty, barren corridors and an empty strip of sky that you see, and you're meditating on it. You know, it's a different relationship entirely. While Corbusier wants you to feel your body, feel the body and in nature, Ando seems to kind of want to frame nature as an object of meditation. If the difference between the two is clear, so in that sense, both of them have completely different attempts towards the way they want to use concrete, and therefore the kind of idea of finish, etc., will automatically change. Uh, in fact, Corbusier was pretty all right with leaving the formwork का जो pattern होता है ना on the concrete, वो दिखेगा, while and which is, you know, it's wood, you are able to see the streaks in the concrete and things like that. While Ando designs his formwork such that you get that smoothness with those 4 dots, no? That you see across that entire surface, which kind of works as one really. It almost works like it's not necessarily concrete. So good question, Devishi. Whether Corbusier was so inspired by nature, what was the reason for choosing concrete as the prime material? He was, so it's question. He was inspired by the natural. He wanted the body to be one with nature, and concrete with its brutality was like a version of rock in some sense. Is my take. I mean, I have never lived to ask Cobb, but it might have been. But it seems to me like he's really trying to work with concrete like it's a new kind of sculptural stone, and he's really sculpting spaces through that. That's my kind of take on this. It's interesting, like, you know, even that staircase that was shown above in what's that, mill owners, where there's the exposed brick wall of one of the kind of edge walls, and you have the stair that is just running alongside it, and you have a concrete railing that is floating just like, you know, a few inches away from it, where both materials are allowed to, in some sense, express themselves for what they are. And I don't know about what is natural and what is artificial material. Also, I'm not very kind of certain about that, honestly, because, like, you know, is dressed stone natural or not? Is, you know, really kind of. I felt that they were meant for awe and woo for the visitors, and its purposes, who it really serves, the users, was kinda ignored. Now, good question. I mean, I think it's an interesting point that you're saying. The key word here is purpose. What is the purpose of a building? You know, there can be different ways in which you can frame that. There's the purpose of the building is the fact that it's a home, that people need to live and shit there. Fine. Okay. That way to anything. I mean, my toilet will be fine as an arcade. I mean, you know, it's just a thing, right? My bedroom and that toilet is all I really need. So, but if my purpose is a little bit beyond that, if my purpose is also to cater to the desires of my architect, of my client, let's say, of the user, and if the desires of the user are like in, let's say, in Rorschach, it's a desire towards divinity, it is desire towards something, or in India, it is a desire towards modernism, then does the architect kind of not have a responsibility to cater to that desire? Is the desire not the purpose of the building as well? That is something that I kind of am constantly kind of thinking, because often when we think about purpose, we try and imagine that that we can be reduced down to being only like machines. Like, I am a machine, I have no desire, I have no aspirations, I have no love, I have no affection, I have no ego. I am merely a machine. Therefore, my purpose is I will mathematically map you and I will kind of design only for that, and that is the end of the situation. कुछ भी एक डब्बा दे दो, as long as my purposes are satisfied, it is okay. If that is the case, then we should not be enjoying music, or we should not be kind of enjoying anything actually. Because I think what happens is that architecture and culture works in many more layers than purely that of quote unquote purpose. In fact, purpose and function as the central kind of role of architecture is a relatively new phenomenon, if you think about it. Form follows function and all of these things. Because many times architecture is homes or churches, etc., have been built because they represent the desires of a community or the aspirations of a community, whether that's a temple as well. So one should really kind of think about what, when one is talking about purpose, to think about what are the various purposes of this building. It's not, can't be reduced down to only its function. This is my suggestion. But it's of course up to you to kind of decide as to the way that you would like to read a building. I haven't read much about Corbusier. It's a vague notion, but what if we change the location of his structures from hot moderate to a cold climate? Will its 5 points for a new architecture be valid, or is he a designer only for hot moderate climates? I think his structures lack in context. I don't know whether he would do that. I mean, honestly, in like if Ronchamp as well as Villa Shodhan are being built, I mean, in his later years, they both seem to have very different approaches to the idea of climate too, and both of them serve very different purposes. I have a feeling that okay, this is another. I'm going to very quickly say this just so that we kind of get this over with. I like the fact that a lot of y'all are skeptical about Corbusier. I think it's a very good thing. It's very good to have skepticism concerning heroes, because I am not one who appreciates heroes, and I think it's a good thing that we are skeptical about their work. Okay. But that skepticism shouldn't lead us to not learn from them. So skepticism is a good thing. I would suggest that rather than kind of running about trying to find यार तुम ये स्वयंवर नहीं है, तुम इससे शादी नहीं करने वाले हो. We are here, we look at the work, we will see things, we will learn things, we will say, this was nice, that was wrong, that was a beautiful staircase, that sucked, that was a terrible idea. But that doesn't necessarily mean that one needs to kind of sit about saying, I like and I don't like Corbusier. It's a completely different matter. It's not about liking and disliking, it's about learning from. Okay, first. So when you think his structures lack in context, you might have to explain that a little further. Does a house in, and of course, what is context? That is also the next thing to ask. Is the context, I think we can go back to that question concerning function. Is the context only the physical surroundings, or is the context also the desire for change? If it is also the desire for change, or if it's not the desire for change, then any kind of modern movement is a lack in context. Because Ashwini, you seem to be kind of contradicting yourself when you say if we change the locations of his structures from a hot moderate to a cold climate. First of all, I don't know whether he was even concerned about the 5 points later on. Ronchamp has none of those 5 points, for example. You know, it's just a crazy wild building.
No, actually, if we talk about the vertical louvers and all, so the Brise Soleil, so it's kind of for a hotter climate, so I'm still not convinced. If we talk about La Tourette and Assembly Hall, so the facades are almost like most of his structures, the facades are almost identical. It's a free facade, so if we shift the location to a cold climate, will the structure be same, or like
it'll automatically change? No? Every context evolves its own solution. He may have screwed up in some places, he may not have screwed up in other places, no? But he may have gotten caught up कि मेरा style है तो मुझे ये करना पड़ेगा, which also sometimes happens. But I don't know, because I think that from what I've heard, I've never again been to La Tourette, so I can't say. But for what I've heard, that La Tourette is supposed to be extraordinary as a building and as a place to be in. From people who've been there. They again just might be Corbusier bugs, but that's it. Who's to know? So I think that there's enough of a variety in his work to assume that he was aware of the fact that every context brings its own solution. I don't think Corbusier was proposing an architecture that was in some sense contextless. We'll talk about some of that kind of architecture that has also happened in modernity in the next class, for certain. There has been that kind of thing. Often though, and Ashwin, you are right, often though, this RCC frame structure was seen as a be-all end-all solution to any kind of context. And you'll find that sort of example around the world where you have Corbusier light buildings that have been built everywhere. But there are many other questions, and we'll come back to these. I think a lot of them are part of a similar kind of story. Ritika, but even the architect has a freedom of expression, right? It's not only about functionality. Absolutely, every architect is a participant in a process, and as a participant, the architect brings his or her own identities into a conversation with the particular site. So yeah, you have a certain way in which your own identity is playing with the existing context to shape the spaces. Villa Savoye wasn't temporary. Villa Savoye is old, man. I mean, maybe it's temporary. I don't know. Maybe the idea of natural or sustainable materials got more pronounced at a later stage after concrete seeped into all kinds of construction as a break away from it for obvious reasons. Yeah, I think the entire the natural is one story, but the sustainability debate actually is one that begins, I would say, in the 60s in around the world, when it's seen that it's that these large new cities, the crazy development that was happening was horrific on the natural resources of the world. You also realize that the fossil fuels that were generating all our so-called development were finite, and they are going to run out, and we are going to need other sources. So yes, the idea of sustainability begins a rise somewhere in the 60s and the 70s after Corbusier has dead and gone largely. Corbusier's 5 points were more to do with the structure of the building. Had he any such principles for the natural or no, he didn't actually. But if you he no, he didn't. His 5 points were in many ways for me very reductive ideas that even reduced his buildings down to some stupid formulas. His buildings are richer than that. If you see the High Court, for example, I don't know how many of the 5 points he ticks. I think the 5 points were generated in his early years as part of an argument that in 30 years later he might have kind of modified and outgrown also. But I don't know whether he had such principles for the natural or cultural context for his buildings. I don't believe he had principles in like a set like we will write this down kind of way. Anushri is saying during the advent of concrete was just another material and the analysis of environmental repercussions wasn't a thing. If someone claims to be inspired from nature in today's times, the choice of materials will be more critical while analyzing a building. It's true. I think we live in a time now. I think, you know, if you have to kind of talk about where we are, what is the label for the time that we are living in now, I guess you could call it the post-human, where the human being is now seen largely as part of as like a being connected to other systems and not an autonomous thing, and therefore then the human being has a responsibility to the other systems in the world as well, and can't afford to in many ways be wasteful or violent towards nature. So that is it is something that we are seeing happening now, especially now. Given the COVID crisis and given the way that nature seems to have been able to completely turn our world upside down. Or koi wants to ask something? Yeah. So if there are no more sorts of immediate questions, are there? I think somebody I can hear turning their microphone on. Hello.
No, I guess this is it. I think so.
Okay, so I think Corbusier is worth looking at a little bit more. Okay, let me tell you, when I first, okay, I have been to Chandigarh 3-4 times. Okay, the first time I went to Chandigarh, was, in the sort of in the heat of when I was young, like एकदम ऐसे यार क्या समझता है क्या अपने आप को चंडीगढ़ टाइप, हाँ, Corbusier, and all this modernist horribleness, and I had read all these articles that had trashed Chandigarh left, right, and center. So I went, and you know how you are, no? When you're young, you want to kind of challenge the great masters. So I went over there the first time, and I was like, "ये क्या गंदा जगह है ये वो," and I was like, completely anti actually Corbusier, especially the city, which I still kind of think is quite a strange city. I wasn't able to even see the architecture very well because I think I was clouded. My vision was clouded at that point. I think it was 4 or 5 years later, I'd gone to Amritsar on a study trip with the third year students. And that was a time when this class was also smaller, like 40 people. And of course, Amritsar gaye the, so we took a detour via Chandigarh. And at that time, actually, that is when Chandigarh really, and the buildings, actually, there's 3 buildings in Chandigarh. Actually, there's 2 buildings. I'm not very fond of the large kind of secretariat building. But the High Court as well as the Assembly, those buildings were stunning for me at that point. The way that they worked within the let's say the dynamic of movement, the light and shadow. I mean, whatever Cobb wanted to do at that point seemed to work on me then. Since then, I've been kind of fond of Chandigarh, but I do understand that it's not necessarily the greatest city to be in. Especially that silly, ridiculous plaza that exists between those 2 buildings is just horribly hot in the summer, and it seems like completely wrong for that particular climate. Zoya, you and Sayukta were supposed to present towards a new architecture. Okay, chal, let's do it next time. But I don't know, is it necessary to do it in that sense? We seem to have covered a lot of what was being said in towards a new architecture. You want to do it now? I mean, we can even do it now. We have time. We have time until 5, right? So we have some time right now.
We don't mind doing it now.
So let's do it now. So let's have that conversation and then we'll discuss it and then we'll end class by talking about what we can do next time. ठीक है Zoya?
Okay.
Okay, chalo.
Can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay. This book was originally called as Weyer's Architecture. We know quite a lot about architecture. So what I would like to basically talk about where the ideas in the book came from. Corbusier was born in Switzerland. During the World War I, Switzerland was basically like a neutral country. So a lot of people who were not participating in the war or were against it gathered in Switzerland, and Switzerland became like a hotbed for these intellectual discussions that were happening, and that influenced a lot of Corbusier's mindset. Also, he traveled a lot in Europe, and his interest in visual arts and architectural styles really influenced his thinking. In 1918, when Corbusier came to Paris, he got along with this Cubist painter called Amédée Ozephon. Basically, Cubism is an artistic movement where the paintings normally are represented in a single viewpoint, but in Cubism the paintings are represented in multiple viewpoints, and then they are broken down and reassembled in an abstract form. This movement was greatly happening during that time. But Corbusier had a very critical view about it, and together with Amédée Ozephon, he established a new artistic movement, which was Purism. So it was exactly in criticism to this, where he felt that objects should be depicted and represented in their elementary forms without any of the unnecessary details. and they wrote all of their ideas in this journal called L'Esprit Nouveau, which from which basically a lot of articles in this book come from. So, so the book is basically a collection of 7 essays, in which Corbusier is trying to convey his idea of modern architecture. And throughout the book, he is basically dismissing the contemporary trends of Art Deco and eclecticism. So, he was trying to replace them with an architecture which was not a stylistic experiment. So, during that time, eclecticism was a lot very prevalent, where people tried to merge different styles into something new, and he was very critical of this, and he felt that architecture was meant to be a language in which humans interacted with the building, so basically more functional. And this new mode of living was a product of the new spirit, which was defined because of the modern industrial age in Europe at that time, and this demanded the rebirth of architecture, which was more functional, and the new aesthetic, which was based on pure form. Yeah.
Yeah. Wait, has the slide changed?
Yeah, can you not see it?
Okay, now I can. So the first essay is The Aesthetic of the Engineer. Corbusier begins his writings with a fierce assertion: architecture is lost in the past and is disconnected. The engineers, inspired by the law of economy and governed by mathematical calculation, puts us in accord with the universal law. He achieves harmony. So about the engineer, next. Wait, I can't see the slide.
I've changed the slide.
Yeah, I'll just see through mine. The engineer is praised for his ability to fabricate the tools of his time that encompass everything except for houses. He is viewed as healthy, active, useful, in control, and happy with his work. He will soon isolate the architect from his own profession, since he no longer possesses the skills to keep it. The engineer has figured a way to produce architecture through mathematical calculation derived from nature. So he's praising the engineer because he started to embrace the new technology and build simple, effective structures that serve human purposes, which are purest in their form, and are honest constructions which shall shun all the irrelevant ornament which deprive the original structure of its function and purest form. On the other hand, the architect is disillusioned, unemployed, arrogant, annoying, and soon enough will be out of job. He is no longer conscious of his own beginnings and is often troubled by styles and the question of structure fashionably. The architect fails to adapt to the transformations that have affected the world both formalistically and functionally through the machine. For the architects to regain their position and relevance, they must embrace the new artistic ideal that derives its existence from a new way of life, which was manifested in architecture, which can stir the emotional and spiritual views of a person, which an otherwise just pretty building cannot. He also goes on to comparing the architect to a milkman who sells poisoned milk. Then there's another chapter, 3 reminders to architects, them being mass, surface, and plan. Mass and surface are important parts of structures in architecture. Most of the constructions having geometrical forms and mathematical calculations satisfy our eyes as visual. He also talks about light being an assist for us to be able to perceive these geometrical forms. Architectural beauty is enabled through geometry. Corbusier supports that primary forms are beautiful forms because they are natural and not affected by many styles. The combination of such many styles cause ambiguity, like in cathedrals where there's a mixture of simple form and complex geometry. He states that the great problems of modern construction must have a geometrical solution. His statements about mass and surface rely on the works of engineers rather than architects of the time. In fact, he thinks of architecture that architecture of the time should take more references from engineering and factories of the industrial era. He emphasizes how important it is to use simple geometric forms, which will create more enthusiasm in our minds when we look at the construction. Now, to the surface. The surface should reveal what is inside rather than concealing it. He says that the simplicity of geometry is through plan, without which it lacks order. Corbusier mentions that it is a risky thing to think about aesthetics or beauty in a design, first because it may result in some ambiguity. I suppose that the main thing to focus on a design process is function, because pure reflection of functioning well results in beautiful and aesthetic buildings. So the aim of designing should never be just beautifying the buildings. Regulating lines. This is an architectural design concept that uses proportions of geometry to create harmony and order. In the primitive times, the lines were used for different intentions, such as defining space, to live in, or paths to find directions. In their plans, they used basic mathematical calculation. They did these basic plans in order to build well solidity and strong construct. Using regulating lines in design helps combine artistic and mathematical thoughts to create satisfaction, because these lines cannot be used without measurement and calculations. Like in the first picture, if you see the Notre Dame, we can see the connection between both of them, the square and the circles. The square has 4 right angles, and the right angles help us to take the scale from something. Not only the shapes are similar, but the regulating lines are similar too. On the right, you see the capital Rome. The placing of the right angle has come into play to determine the intentions of Michelangelo, causing the same principle. So these were how the regulating lines were used. In his chapter, Eyes That Do Not See, he talks about simplicity. He uses the term primitive man to show how complicated architecture has become, and that going backwards was the only way to move forward. According to him, the architects who are not realizing that the new aesthetic, not realizing the new aesthetic ideal and the pure forms being produced, can't see the simplicity of things, and hence blindly continue to produce over decorated buildings. Yukta.
Yeah. Yeah. So, in this essay, Architecture, Corbusier praises Greek and Roman architecture a lot because of the simple geometric forms in them. So, he feels that these structures are pure and simple. And that makes it timeless. But he also says that there's a lesson to be learned from Rome. So according to Corbusier, a motor car was a true symbol of modernity. So he makes comparison between Parthenon and car. So he compared a 21 Delage to Parthenon, where he said that 21 Delage was a classic car, and people liked it, but no one wants to buy it now, because now that's a car with outdated technology. So he said that people eventually need to move on, and they do. Okay. So mass producing house. Here he said that house is a machine for living in. So this was highly debated, and what he meant was that house is basically just a place to live in. So that was his primary function, and hence any unnecessary decoration that is elicited because of some tradition should be completely negated. And when he said mass producing houses, a lot of people interpreted it in a way that because of it we would lose the sense of beauty that architecture strikes with. But Corbusier had different views. So because in that time in Europe, very massive new cities were being built, and what architects were doing was they were building decorated houses for the wealthy clients. But then a lot of the people from lower classes could not have the luxury, so they could not afford such houses. So what Corbusier meant was that if mass producing houses, so if we had to build 10,000 houses, then you would have to search for certain standards that would go well for everyone, and in search of those standards, you could lead to perfection. So that would in a way be functional, and people could get houses according to their requirements. This was the last essay in his book. This actually originally his book was supposed to be called as Architectural Revolution. So in this essay, he was basically questioning whether architecture should revolutionize and end the problems of these lower class people, or it should be just a decorative piece of art. What he advocated was that house is a commodity which should be available to people according to their use. But then the question arose that what is the root of the current social unrest? Is it architecture or the revolution? So what he concluded as that basically tools are a result of successive improvement, and here by tools he meant progress. So in a way that when one tool is discovered, we tend to throw the older one, and this is manifestation of health. So it is not good when we just produced a bad thing because of a bad tool, and nor is it right to waste our energy. So these tools should be utilized, and they must be replaced when needed. So yeah.
Thank you both. As you can see, this particular book was written in, I think which year was it written, my dear?
1923.
See, 1923, right? And when was let's say the Shodhan Villa was built in 1956 or so. So you can imagine that in those 30 years, there's a kind of growth that somebody goes through. So one should not necessarily kind of look at his work as a description of those 5 points. Those 5 points were made at a certain time, at a point in between the two world wars, where the world was one thing, and in 1954 he's kind of in the post-World War world. He's building buildings around in India and places like that. So it's another sort of world that he's entering, and his projects at that point are talking about maybe that world. I'm just keeping this open-ended. But one of the things that you find within this book is this kind of many of the ideas that simply one look at Rochamp and you know that he said like all that stuff that I wrote in Towards a New Architecture is no longer relevant. No? There are no 5 points. There is no strict geometry. There is none of that stuff that he's kind of saying. But you do see some of the obsessions of the early modern period. You see the obsession with ideas of order. You see the obsession with the machine. You see the obsession with kind of purity. All of these obsessions are very much a kind of part of Towards a New Architecture, the book itself. And maybe his early imaginations of architecture too. Corbusier was in some sense saw himself as the vehicle for modern cities. He would in some way imagine the modern city for us. He came up with many proposals where he tried to imagine this modern city. The only one that actually got implemented is Chandigarh. But he did come up with plans for Paris, for Algiers, for cities around the world actually, that usually consisted of fast-moving cars, zooming highways, and high-rises, because these were the images that he had for what modern cities are supposed to be like. And to achieve those modern cities, he was like, "Acha, ye purana stuff sab nikal do, nahi chahiye. Let's just demolish entire cities and replace it with these new things." A sort of violence that he's become infamous for. What we'll do is maybe kind of next week come back to some of these themes of that he's interested in the 1920s in Paris and in Switzerland, about about modernity. It's also kind of nice that you brought up the fact that Corbusier was actually not alone in this. He was really part of a circle, an intellectual circle that consisted of artists, you know, uh, philosophers, all kinds of people, who were all involved in some sense and caught up in the excitement of the new world and caught up in the excitement of modernity and trying to participate in what it could become. So we'll be actually looking at a lot of these across the next few months before we move to the 60s and the 70s. So it's good to I think, you know, one of the things I do is I keep a timeline. I like to kind of place everything that I see and everything that I do within a timeline, just so that it kind of locates that particular idea within a particular time and a context. It just helps me figure arcs out and influences out a little bit more easily. You all have to work your own way of keeping notes and records of these lectures and of other ideas that you might have in that blog that we've suggested that you do. I would suggest that if we can have the first draft of the format for that from everybody in the next 2 weeks, it will be quite useful, so that we know that you all are working on it, because it's not something that we want you to put together at the end. Sarthak has asked 2 questions while you guys were presenting. One is that he says that, can we also talk about Corbusier's way of using color and the paintings he always made on the doors? He didn't always make paintings on the doors. He did paint the doors of the main building, of the assembly. That is a painting that he did kind of design. He also designed the pattern for the for what do you call them? These long pieces of cloth that are hung in the High Court ka jo rooms hai. And it was very interesting. The tapestries in the High Court. In that, if you look at the symbols that he uses in those paintings, a lot of them are tending to be about universal themes like sunsets, sunrises, solstices, you know, landscapes. Those are the sorts of themes that he evokes when he's making those drawings, because I think he is, even in those, evoking this idea of the man in nature often. So when I first came back from the US, just as a separate aside, I was working with an architect called Dhiru Thadani, and Dhiru was a big Corbusier fan, and he actually had a book talking about colors. He had a book which had the Pantone of all the colors that Corbusier used, and he used to use only colors from that. So he was a total Corbusier bhakt. So there was a particular tone of colors that he used, that Corbusier seemed to use, that he loved anyway. As far as Cubism, I think we'll come to it, Sarthak. I don't want to kind of go down that road right now. It's definitely something we'll come to when we are talking about this question of speed, and we'll kind of come to that, how ideas of perception, because okay, I started, I might as well talk. One thing that happens with the modern human being is that our ways of seeing have changed because of the camera, because of cinema, because of photography, right? That the way that we capture the world has changed. So Cubism actually comes from that urgency. So does Impressionism. Impressionism was actually a study of what are the various colors that constitute light and color, right? And Cubism comes from a similar thing. Is it possible for, on one picture plane, to capture all the surfaces of an object? So Cubism seems like an analytical project to analyze an object through different perspectives. Ishan, how do we compare the Renaissance period with modernity? Le Corbusier's context in terms of their aim to making man as the measure of all things and establishing the relationship with human body and nature. Yes. So Ishan, I would say that Corbusier's modernity comes from kind of the roots of the Enlightenment and the Renaissance. The shift away from God to man is, of course, that doesn't happen in the 1900s and the 1920s. It is a journey that can be traced back to the Enlightenment. Which is the place that all of these ideas begin to take root within society. And I think Corbusier in many ways is carrying that tradition forward in the work that he is kind of working. What was the ideological difference between the grand ornate cathedrals and Le Corbusier Ronchamp, with the religion and older context being challenged in both periods? I don't know. the architecturally they're very, very different, but whether they serve very different purposes ideologically is a debate. I don't know. I often feel that although the modernists and the modernists claimed that they were very often breaking with the past and doing these ekdam aise radical things, too often I don't think they were. Very often the basic structures of society or the structures of knowledge were not necessarily being challenged that much by them. And that is one of the big kind of accusations that they also have to face later on. For example, our own modernity and what we like to call Nehruvian modernity. In our country, it has gone through the same, it has also suffered the same accusations. It is said that Nehru himself was a privileged lawyer, and in the modernity that was imagined, although he claimed, or they claimed, the modernists claimed that it was supposed to be a place for emancipation for everyone. In modern India, the same old feudal sorts of structures were replicated in modern India. So there is that accusation as well. The question that you're asking is open for debate, and you have many people who have tried to some senses unpack that. What is the relationship of the claims to modernity with the reality on the ground? That is a complicated question that we're still facing actually. That what have been the benefits and what have been the failures of that entire period of our own modernity? There have been benefits and there have been miserable failures, and for us to come to terms with this, to be able to confront both. Okay, so I think we'll end now. We can continue this conversation about all of these ideas in the later classes as well. None of these can be completely answered. These are all points for a discussion. So if anyone else wants to kind of pipe in on this, please do. Next week we'll be looking at maybe the Bauhaus. You all studied the Bauhaus last year with Manoj?
Yes.
You all did. What did you all do with the Bauhaus? Just can we know so we don't repeat that?
We talked about the campus.
You saw the building.
Yeah, and then the furnitures the students like produced, and we also saw. I'm not sure of it, but I guess we also saw the posters and those things. I'm not sure though.
Okay. Did you think about why those happened the way they were? Or was there any kind of conversation about that? Or was it primarily a formal analysis of the Bauhaus?
It wasn't in detail that why it occurred, but yeah, there was a like it was introduced, not in that depth though.
Okay, so then we can talk about it again to some extent. What do you think?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's do the Bauhaus. Let's look at the building again. Can somebody read the Bauhaus manifesto? There's a manifesto somewhere. You can read that. There's a manifesto that can be read. Let's keep it kind of tighter next class, because let's just look at one building and one manifesto. Jin, what do you think? Or should there be more? Janella?
I think it's good. I think we do the manifesto in one building. And then
I
we
think
can
that should
discuss
be fine.
ideas. Yeah, we can discuss ideas around it then.
Yeah. And then we can bring towards the new architecture some of the points that these people also raised into that conversation. And maybe then we can even discuss Habib Rahman and the India angle of this.
Okay. Oh, yeah.
All right. So if somebody, Jin, you'll just kind of tell who, just pick two people.
Does anyone want to volunteer, or should we pick someone?
Jin,
okay.
pick, yeah.
Okay. All right. Atira, you'll do the Bauhaus manifesto?
Yeah, I'll do it.
Okay. All right. And somebody else wants to join her? Raj, what about you? Is Raj here?
Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Okay. And you do the Bauhaus building and just maybe one more Walter Gropius building. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Chalo. Bye. See you guys. Enjoy yourselves.
Okay, bye.
What will be the time for the next lecture?
Oops.
Oh shit.
कोमल चले गए वो।
छोड़ दे अब